Hey everyone, I'm Jack, and in today's video I'll be ranking the bosses of Striking Distance Studios' The Callisto Protocol from worst to best. As has been well documented by a plethora of mainstream critics and content creators for over a month now, The Callisto Protocol is a praiseworthy but ultimately flat spiritual successor to Dead Space that aimed to but failed to recapture the magic of its air. More disappointing to most, however, was that it was yet another new-gen AAA game released with shocking performance issues that made it practically unplayable. Beyond game-breaking quandaries, The Callisto Protocol features repetitive combat, a lackluster atmosphere, and mediocre horror, all of which the game's creators marketed as its highlights. Those points are all legitimate, however, we here at Cytonox happen to not share the same opinions as most content creators and definitely not those of game journalists. When I saw that most major news companies were rating the game in the 50 to 60% range, I knew I was in for a good time. If anything, I'm actually in the small but rising minority that, contrary to basically any other opinion I've seen on this game, loved the Callisto Protocol. Admittedly, it failed to scare me even a single time, had significant frame rate problems on its HDR visual upscale mode on the PS5, and to only confirm what's been known, the combat is janky and slightly repetitive, most noticeably when facing multiple enemies at once in cramped arenas, as shown here.
Oh my god, what the fuck, dude? Are you kidding me?
However, I was amazed by the visuals and became thoroughly invested in the characters, narrative, and overall world created by this first spawn of what will hopefully evolve into an eventual franchise. To simplify it into one sentence, for me, the Callisto Protocol universe is more interesting than the Dead Space universe. Take what you will from that. It goes without saying that the Callisto Protocol is very similar to Dead Space in its overall experience and general story structure, and also like the Dead Space games, there's a significant lack of boss fights in quantity, but still just barely enough to warrant a ranking. I am also a fan of the game's combat, disregarding the clip I just showed, and I had a great time with it, making use of the GRP, stun baton, hand cannon, and riot gun. However, due to the combat's dodge system having the exact same movement for every encounter, as well as the GRP and occasionally the stun baton being rendered useless against bosses, this list is quite arbitrary, and if you disagree, sound off in the comments. It's also worth noting before we dive in that I played this on medium security with no accessibility features and on performance mode over visual upscale, as once again the frame rate was just a bit worse with HDR rendering. The Callisto Protocol was by no means perfect, but I absolutely recommend it to any and all fans of the Dead Space series. With an exciting narrative, top-notch visuals and sound design, and an overwhelming atmosphere, it has a lot going for it. How does the quality of its boss fights compare? Let's find out. I'm not usually optimistic about melee-based humanoid boss fights, as it's hard to create an interesting and unique encounter without some form of apparatus or external ability. Due to the combat's inherent design, and namely its dodge system, every boss fight is repetitive and easy, with minimal mechanical expansion and little combat depth. This is most evident with Captain Ferris, whose entire moveset is just a single combo that varies between 3 to 6 consecutive punches. Before we get there, however, let's provide some context for this encounter. Captain Ferris, the head of security at Black Iron Prison and the Warden's right-hand man, is first encountered immediately after Jacob and Max crash land on Callisto, searching the UJC Charon for any survivors. Ferris then finds Jacob and Danny Nakamura inside the ship, Danny being the leader of the terrorist group The Outer Way, responsible for the bioweapon attacks on Europa. The Warden then contacts Ferris, telling him to arrest the pair but keep them alive, sending the captain on a spiral and ridding him of any friendly pretenses he held with Jacob initially, from then on referring to him as inmate 521 only. Jacob then wakes up in his cell to find Black Iron overrun, eventually running into Ferris only to get interrogated by the captain, who questions Jacob on why the Warden wants him alive and what his place in this sudden apocalypse is. After Jacob escapes Ferris's GRP and runs from the light tower to reconvene with Elias, Ferris gets taken down by a pack of biophages and from that point is assumed dead. However, just as Jacob and Elias were preparing to leave Black Iron's main complex, Ferris returns, clearly infected but still with his mental faculties. Once you reach the last segment of Colony, the story truly unfolds, revealing that the Universal Jupiter Company used Black Iron Prison as a front to research and control the biophage pathogen, using prisoners as subjects for human experimentation, with the eventual goal being to form the next evolutionary branch of humanity through accelerated evolution via the biophage pathogen, with the UJC hoping to create a human being capable of living in extreme environments in space for long periods of time. Now, what is the biophage pathogen? The biophage pathogen is a parasitic disease whose first outbreak took place under Callisto in the Arcus mines 75 years prior to the Callisto Protocol. The pathogen spread after miners broke through Callisto's ice surface and released a gigantic alien creature, full of parasitic larvae that infected many of the colonizers in Callisto's mines. One miner who became infected was able to not just retain his mental capacity, but use the pathogen to his advantage, synthesizing it throughout his body. He became known as Subject Zero. After Subject Zero was killed by UJC security during the sterilization of Arcus Station, the UJC completed the sterilization process by massacring the entire Arcus colony, and from then began researching the biophage pathogen for potential use. For decades, they struggled to hone the infection until, under the lead of Warden Duncan Cole and head researcher Dr. Caitlin Mahler, finally took control of the disease and, in doing so, completed their overarching goal of replicating Subject Zero. The UJC then released the biophage pathogen on Europa and framed the outer way to cover up their scheme, while using contracted truckers like Jacob to transport vials of the pathogen across Jupiter's moon system, a tip later revealed in Tower. After Jacob and Danny were arrested, the vials found on Jacob's ship were released into Black Iron Prison per Duncan Cole's command, a second attempt at evolutionary advancement, dubbed the Callisto Protocol. If you want an entire rundown of the story, check out Gaming Harry's thorough explanation, which I used to help me script this segment, linked in the description. I recommend it. The Callisto Protocol has one of the more interesting plots I've seen in a game, and the video itself is great. Nonetheless, Dr. Mahler finally contacts Jacob in the last room of Colony, telling him of a Subject Alpha, the first successful biological replication of Subject Zero. Enter Captain Leon Ferris, more biophage than human at this point, and more powerful than ever. Ferris's physical design is alright. It looks like a pruned Thanos to me, but Sam Witwer's performance kept me engaged, and once again, Ferris's importance to the narrative and lore was enough on its own to have my attention. With that said, the fight is, well, nothing. Ferris has a lone combo that you either dodge then shoot him, like I did in the first encounter, or use the stun baton, which if you have the damage level 2 upgrade is the ideal option. I wish Ferris could have had even just one attack using the GRP, stun baton, or even some of the UJC special ops weapons, just to create some form of variety, which for me would have propelled this fight greatly. But as it stands, the lack of anything beyond simple punches and cinematic kicks makes Ferris the rightful worst boss in this ranking. Captain Ferris's finale, while massively controversial and really not great, is for me just a hair better than his repetitive humanoid state. Jacob walks in on the Warden in the midst of a meeting with what I assume to be the Circle, the leading group that rules over the commonality, and is promptly called Vir Solitarius, the Lone Man. Shortly afterwards, Ferris returns and is revealed as the Alpha by the Warden, with Duncan Cole following this up by pitting him against Jacob, Vir Solitarius, the Lone Man, versus the next evolutionary step of humanity, or, as the Warden said, humanity against my Alpha. And when this initial fight began, I was like, alright, I mean, he didn't really change at all from the laboratory, but I guess he's the Alpha. Although, after this brief second encounter, Ferris takes control of the duel and he nearly kills Jacob before rapidly transforming into a hulking beast, finally entering this heavily teased Alpha state, a transition similar to many of the final bosses in the Resident Evil series, take Nemesis or Lord Sadler. In this state, Ferris is still competent, but now a disgusting amalgamation of organic matter, with a face covered by a medium health bodily shield and numerous growths across his body. As well, Ferris gains a couple new attacks, those being a blockable acid toss, a sprint, and one-shot single attack punches, meaning perfection is required to beat this fight. One hit and you're dead. On his own, Ferris isn't that challenging, especially with explosive magnum rounds that stagger him, but with the second phase, biophage exploders begin to come in from all sides of the large office building. Enemy padding is fine on occasion, but in a game lacking an interactive dodge mechanic, for example pressing circle in the Souls games, evading these biophages is practically impossible when focusing on multiple targets, and is also just fucking annoying. The outside walkway you went through before engaging the warden is filled with ammo crates and health packets, giving you a bit of reprieve, but it is just difficult and frustrating as shit trying to balance exploders and Ferris both. Ferris is hyper aggressive on top of all of this, so turning your back is a bad idea, but is also required due to exploders spawning from 3 different sections in the large dome. When you do turn your back, you have no way of avoiding his sprint punch, which kills Jacob on impact and restarts you from the very beginning. Now, do you see the problem? The best strategy I found was to use magnum rounds then the riot gun in the first phase, then run into the walkway for the second and constantly move to stay on top of exploder spawns, as well as to keep an eye on Ferris to dodge him when the time calls. Overcoming this behemoth was satisfying but undoubtedly frustrating, a mediocre final boss capping off one of the most intriguing finales to a video game I've seen. With stealth boss battles, simplicity is paramount. This is even more important when the stealth in question is life or death, as is the case with the Universal Jupiter Company's security units. I actually quite enjoyed this game's take on stealth gameplay. The blind were a fun but slightly overused mechanic, but with the GRP, the potential for different ways to approach stealth made it much more bearable. However, the highlight of stealth combat for me was the terrifying security units that made only a few appearances throughout the game. From a design point, they look great, and also dangerous, and as you find out pretty immediately, are very dangerous. Jacob's first encounter with a security unit takes place right after the introduction, where you have to sneak by one without being captured. Later on, you find a second unit patrolling a storage room, and you kill it by shooting it in the head. If you miss or hit its exoskeleton, the unit will start firing away and kill Jacob. There is a second encounter later in the Nature Dome in the Colony level, although the arena is much wider and it should be over pronto. UJC security units are simple, fun, and have limited appearances, exactly what I like in a mini-boss. Remember back to the introduction when I said this list is fairly arbitrary? Well, here you go. After scrounging around the internet for 15 or so minutes, I couldn't find a single positive comment on Two Heads anywhere. If anything, every link mentioning the first major boss fight of this game was either a bland review guide, a complaint post on Reddit, or a negative article from a game journalist. Game Rant's article, titled Why the Callisto Protocol's Two-Head Goes from One of Its Best Monsters to Most Annoying, does bring up a few valid arguments, namely the lack of evolution across the 4 appearances, making Two-Heads monotonous bullet sponges on repeat encounters, and I'd like to tack on that there was definite overuse of Two-Heads in Colony and Tower that threw off the pacing of the game's boss battles, with all 4 of them, as well as both Ferris fights and Alpha Ferris occurring within the game's final 2 chapters. However, for me, Two Heads were a fantastic break from the basic biophages and blind fought almost exclusively in Colony and Tower, and have by far the best design of any boss or creature in not just this game, but any from the Dead Space series as well. As indicated by their name, Two Heads are mutated biophages with 2 coexistent biophages conjoined at the midsection. The left side has less mass while the right is more brutish, each with their own set of attacks that combine in combos or serve as single swings and punches too. I'm not sure if hitting Two Heads in their knees is a placebo or if it actually works, but I tend to do so in the first phase to ideally stagger them as quickly as possible, although this game lacks critical headshots, so shooting them anywhere along their body does uniform damage. Like the security unit in Alpha Ferris, the stun baton is entirely useless in this phase up until you stun them to the ground. This is when you hit them with a melee combo, dealing significant damage. After you hit Two Head enough, either the left head or right head at random will kill their counterpart, leaving you with just the one half to fight. Luckily, from here, the fight is cheesable. In the later encounters, past the initial on the Arcus platform, you can run around the arena and create space, but as you've likely found out by this point in the game, using a health injector mid-combat simply doesn't work, and especially not against Two Heads, who have enhanced speed and can two-shot Jacob. With one head, you can simply dodge left, shoot, and dodge left endlessly until it keels over and dies. While Two Heads are easy and in turn lack intensity, that's more a fault of the dodge system than their inherent moveset design, I'd argue. As one of my favorite looking bosses in recent memory, Two Heads were without question the best boss in the Callisto Protocol. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't, and be sure to check in every Wednesday for new uploads. That's all for now. Deuces.